the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, relics from Atlantis wash up on California beaches, having strangely migrated from the correctly named ocean. Those that touch them are forced to share the fates of the Atlantans, which is to be stuck in traffic and never-ending roadwork for all eternity without air conditioning.
Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia.
All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel.
And I'm Baen Intern Allie Heilman.
Allie, tell us about what we have for an interview this time on the podcast.
This time we talked to Eric Flint about his new release, Worlds 2, a collection of short fiction that spans several worlds with the written word. There are stories from his Ring of Fire series, Rats, Bats, and Vats universe, a piece from the Honorverse, and even some Eric Flint stories that have never been published before on any timeline.
Very cool. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. But first, here's the news. So, as in days of yore, August is once again a contested month. Allie, is there a contest afoot at Baen right now?
We have a great new contest to unveil for August, based off of Tim Powers' book, Alternate Routes. In the novel, Alternate Routes, ghosts roam the Los Angeles freeways. Now, we've been stuck in LA traffic ourselves, and let us tell you, it can be a long haul, especially if you're in the car alone. So we were wondering, if you had to spend a couple hours in bumper-to-bumper traffic, whose ghost would you want to pass the time with, and why? Let us know in a short 100 words or fewer paragraph for a chance to win a copy of Alternate Routes signed by Tim Powers.
So I guess that could be a fictional ghost or a real ghost. I would probably limit it to a real ghost, though. But, whatever's the best. Go ahead. Tell us how to enter this contest.
Send your entry to contest@baen.com no later than August 20th. Put August Contest in the subject field, and please remember to include your name. 1 entry per person, please. Winners will be selected by the Baen editorial staff, and the winning entry will very likely be published as part of an announcement. So get your ghost on and win a free signed copy of Alternate Routes. We would like to welcome Eric Flint to the podcast. Welcome, Eric.
Hi.
Eric Flint is the co-author of 3-time New York Times bestsellers. He won the Science Fiction Chronicle's Best Novel of the Year award and has been lauded as the science fiction author of particular note, one who can entertain and edify in equal and major measure by Publishers Weekly. Today he is with us to discuss his newest book, Worlds 2, a collection of short fiction that spans several written worlds. So, Eric, you define yourself as a novelist. What circumstances cause you to write and publish pieces that are not novel length?
Well, for the most part, there are some stories in Worlds 2 that I wrote a long time ago. Before I really was seriously trying to become an author, I just sort of wrote them mostly for my own entertainment. Most of what I write in the way of short film, all of it actually nowadays is I write on commission. I don't write a story and submit it to a magazine. It's always somebody has asked me, usually for an anthology of one kind or another. Someone asked me to write a story, and so I go ahead and do it. For instance, one of the stories in the volume is called Operation Xibalba, and that was a story that Gardner Dozois asked me to write, or he was putting together an anthology of a commemorative volume for Poul Anderson. So, it's things like that. I've got a story. Some of the stories are in anthologies I've edited myself. Others are in anthologies someone else edited. That's normally how I do it. I don't. So I wound up writing a fair amount of short fiction, but I don't. And you have to understand, my definition of short fiction includes long novellas and short novels. So I'm more likely to write in that length than I actually am to write in short story length.
There's like 3 novella-length pieces here in Worlds 2, I would say, right, Eric? There's a major Honor Harrington world story, and there's a big old long introductory piece.
I've got Now, Fanatic is technically still a novella, but it's a very long one. It's, I think, 37,000 words long, which for people who are not familiar with the categorization, novellas are anything between 18,000 and 40,000 words. Above 40,000 is considered a novel. The Austro-Hungarian Connection, which I wrote, that's part of the Ring of Fire series, that is a short novel. Technically, Fanatic is a long novella, and so is In the Matter of Savinkov's a long novella. Everything else is probably mostly it's novelette length other than that, looking through it. The first anthology I did, Worlds, did have 2 short novels out. I like that length. I like writing in that length. The problem is that used to be the length of novels. You go back into the 50s and 60s. Those were considered full-length novels. Nowadays, publishers are not going to accept something that short. They for something to be published as a novel in its own, between 2 covers. Nowadays, you got to produce at least 90,000 words minimum. So about the only place you get short novels and long novellas published is in anthologies. But I do like working in that length.
You talk about your connection to Mike Resnick in your Conspiracies and In the Matter of Savannah stories.
Yeah, so
how have your various co-authors kind of informed your writing?
Oh, boy. That's a hard question to answer because I have so many, and they're all different. I started collaborating. It's not anything I planned. It just happened. After I got my first novel published, Jim Bain asked me if I'd like to do a collaboration on a series with David Drake. Jim had a habit of doing that. He would, once an author, you sort of had to write your own first novel just to kind of prove your chops. But after that, Jim would try to hook you up with an established, experienced author. Partly as a learning experience, but partly also just to kind of shield the author. The problem authors face in the commercial market is that once you get your first novel published, nobody really heard of you, so you don't tend to sell too well in the next 2 or 3 novels. Some people do, but most don't. And you then face what Mike Resnick calls the 4th book hurdle, which is that the really hard book to sell is not the first one, it's the 4th one. Because if you haven't been able to sell really well after 3 novels, a publisher will drop you. Now, Bain doesn't really operate that way, but part of what Jim would do is he'd hook you up with an established author, and that would keep your numbers up. So you'd sort of get over that hump. And it worked with me. I wrote after my first novel, the next 4 novels I wrote were with David Drake. Then I did my next solo novel, which was 1632, which sold very well. And after that, I just found I'd enjoyed collaborating, so I kept doing it. And most of my collaboration these days comes through the 1632 series, and it's with new authors emerging out of that series that I'm working with. That's most of my collaborations now. I'm not trying to get around the question you asked me. It's just very hard to answer it because, I give you different answers with every one of them. All collaborations are kind of unique. They're not, cut from the same mold. And you get something different from all of them.
Okay. You add into your stories a lot of idioms and ideas of today's society, such as to bell a cat, or The Best Laid Schemes of Mice and Men, Gang Affaglay. How do you create your blend of new worlds with some of the ideas of this one?
I don't know, because it's not something I even do particularly all that consciously. I mean, it's not like I'm setting out to do that. It just kind of comes naturally to me. I'm less averse than a lot of authors are to what's often derisively called info dumping, which is, just presenting readers with information that may not be immediately or directly relevant to what's happening in the story. Although I do try to make it something that's immediately connected to what's happening in the story, but I think people just find a lot of things interesting, and you can use a novel to explain a whole lot of things as you're going along and make, all kinds of cultural references. Other authors enjoy doing things like referring to pop music and things like that, but I have my own way of doing it.
There's like 3 references in these stories to that particular Burns poem that seems to have stuck with you. In fact, it occurs across universes.
There's that one, and the 2 that I tend to use a lot are that one, and the other one I tend to use a lot, the famous quip by Johnson that, the prospect of being hanged concentrates the mind wonderfully. I think I use those just because they're so applicable, and there are so many situations in which they're very appropriate. I should probably watch out, though, because one of the things I've noticed is that almost in any story I write, I'll tend to get fixated on one word, and I won't realize I'm doing it, and I'll just use it a lot. And I've learned I have to sort of try to keep an eye out for that. The first time I became aware of it was I wrote a novella called Carthago Delenda Est for an anthology that David Drake was putting together. And I wrote the story, sent it to David, and, I called him up on the phone, a week later to see what his reaction to the story was. And he liked the story, but he said, Eric, are you aware that you used the word bizarre 22 times in this story? And, I thought that was a story. And I said, 22 times, I counted them. Things like that will happen. And so I've tried to be aware of that. I'll have to think in the future whenever I'm about to use one of those 2 aphorisms, maybe I've overdone it. I do like them, though. My
particular favorite was the Austro-Hungarian connection. And I wanted to know how you came up with your characters and how you incorporated them into your stories after, you create them in these short fiction pieces.
I came up with the character of János Grugev myself. The Hungarian nobleman is one of the central characters in that story. Most of the other characters, though, were actually initially introduced in the series by Virginia de Mars, either in stories she wrote on her own or she and I collaborated on a couple of novels. The first one was 1634, The Bavarian Crisis. So the characters of Noel and Denise Beasley, in particular, were introduced by, they're originally Virginia's characters, not mine. And Eddie Junkers was actually, I think, originally introduced in the series, I think by Paula Goodland, although I won't swear to that, but then Virginia sort of adopted him. There's a lot of that happened in the 1632 series, where characters will sort of get passed from one author to another, and it's I like those characters, and so I enjoyed working with them and developing them. To me, in some ways, the central character, although, now it's hard to say, the 2 central characters are really Noel and Denise. I mean, János Grugev is the third. He's the male character, but I actually find the 2 female characters most interesting. They're very different. Noel's very straight-laced, very prim and proper. She's a devout Catholic. By the time she gets married, which doesn't happen in that story, it happens. She and János get married in Ottoman Onslaught. But she's still technically a virgin by the time she gets married. I mean, she's into her 20s by then. Denise is very, very different. She's a very brash teenager. Her father was a biker. He gets killed in a recent incident quite heroically. And I find her a lot of fun to work with. Her and her best friend, Minnie Hugelmer. So I'm trying to remember how I wanted to bring the Austrian Empire into the series. That it had been sort of there. Everybody knew it. It was the Habsburg, one of the major Habsburg domains. It was very important, but we hadn't really done much with it. And so I wanted to bring those characters in, and I used that story to do it. So there's political themes introduced in there, and then there's also, I just think it's a really enjoyable adventure. I was also able to develop some stuff around aviation in that story.
Can you give us a little bit of the setup of that story, what the political situation is, and who these people that Janos is leading away, who they are?
What happens in the story, the basic plot is that a small group of Americans basically defect to the Austrians. And it's kind of a weird defection because they're not technically at war with Austria, and it's not like they don't have the right to move to Austria, but they steal a bunch of stuff on their way, and they're actually ducking out of some financial issues, and they got offered a good deal by the Austrian Empire if they'd move to Vienna and sort of help the Austrians, transfer uptime technology. So they begin by taking it on the lam, and Janos Drugev is the one who engineers it. He's serving as an agent for the emperor. He's a good friend of the new emperor, the very young Ferdinand III, who just has become the emperor. His father died in 1634. So he begins by shepherding these people from the United States of Europe into Austria, and two people set out in pursuit of them, and those are Noelle Stowe and her sidekick, Eddie Junkers. Noelle both of them work for a department in the government, the state government. It's not the national government. The state government is running a thing called, and their department is officially the Department of Economic Research, something like that. But what they really are is agents. They're kind of, you can think of them sort of very loosely as FBI agents. Anyway, they take out in pursuit of these characters. And then Denise Beasley takes out in pursuit of them. And she winds up sweet-talking one of the test pilots for one of the two aircraft manufacturers to fly her. And then they accidentally bomb Noelle and Eddie, thinking they're enemies. And then they crash the plane, and then they all get captured by Janos Drugev. So Drugev keeps this whole thing going, this group of defectors and the two different parties of people chasing after him that he arrested, basically. I mean, he's forcing them to come with him because he doesn't want them to be able to go and present word to the authorities where he is. Anyway, he gets them across the mountains, and in the course of that, a attraction develops between him and Noelle. And that then becomes a long-running theme in the series as a whole. It stretches out over several books, and it's not until you get to Ottoman Onslaught, which was published just less than 2 years ago, that they finally get married. Well, so what the story becomes as it develops is really a romance, and the rest of it, in a way, is a sort of vehicle for that to happen. That's basically what the story is. I think I captured a heart of it.
I love that Janos sends her a rose and a bullet. Has a note.
What? Oh yeah,
doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, part of what happens at the end is he's very good friends with the emperor, Ferdinand III. And the Habsburg dynasty, which was the premier dynasty Europeans ever produced, at least after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Habsburgs lasted for about 500 years, and they, at different times, they ruled Austria, Spain. They were the most prominent, powerful dynasty in Europe for half a millennium. And there's a famous saying, which was that the Habsburgs got so powerful not by fighting wars, but by marriage. They just married very intelligently. And there was a saying, it's been around for centuries, of others fight war, thou happy Austria marry. And the same kind of thing happens in this. Is what happens is the emperor is counseling his friend on how to carry out this courtship of, this woman who was born 350 years in the future. So there's a big cultural disparity between them, but it all works out in the end.
The stories that you include in Worlds 2 about the Ring of Fire series often have romantic undertones. Got Eddie's kind of budding romance in there.
Was
that a personal choice to bring in a whole bunch of different little romances, or how did that come about?
Well, the truth is there's a lot of romance all through that series. Actually, there's a lot of romance in pretty much anything I write. What happens in Steady Girl is there are 3 stories from, not counting the big or the long one, the short novel, Austro-Hungarian Connection. There are 3 1632 series short stories. 2 of them are not romances. They focus on Elizabeth and her brother Rupert. These were the children of one of the highest noblemen in Europe. He actually for a while became king of Bohemia, and they become important characters in several stories. So that's the 2 of the stories focused on them. The third one, Steady Girl, the interest between Eddie and Denise actually begins in the Austro-Hungarian Connection. That's where they first meet. And then it just tells the story of how that progresses. And it's it's one of these where Eddie is a downtimer and she's an uptimer, and he's trying to figure out how to court her because he's used to certain customs, and Americans have very different customs. The same theme happens in 1634, the Baltic War, where there's a German farmer who's trying to court an American social worker. I find that's just kind of interesting to write, and a lot of fun, and there's always a lot of humor in those things. It's easy to bring out. There's, I think, quite a bit of humor in most of what I write. I really enjoy the character of Denise Beasley. She's appeared now in a number of different things I've written. Her and her good friend and best friend, Minnie Hogelmeyer, who was just sort of Denise's sidekick for several stories, but then in the Ottoman Onslaught, I turned her into a major character in her own right.
How about we move on to one of the other stories? We've already kind of mentioned Fanatic, and in your preface to Fanatic, you mentioned that it's one of your favorites. What did you enjoy so much about Fanatic?
It was an interesting story to write because the central character is Victor Kasha, who I was actually introduced into David Weber's Honorverse series in a short novel I wrote for him called From the Highlands, which appeared in third of the Honor Harrington anthologies, and then it was reprinted, reissued in my first anthology, Worlds. And that introduced the character Victor Kasha. But when he's introduced in that story, he's young and he's just newly graduated from the State Security Academy, and, he's a newbie. And it shows in the course of that story. The next story I wrote with Victor Kasha, and it was a novel that David and I collaborated on called Crown of Slaves. And Victor is a central character there, but by the time he appears there, he's very different. He's become a very self-assured, confident, extremely good secret agent. And so when David asked me to write another story for the next anthology, I discussed it with him, and we decided it'd be a good idea for me to write a story that depicted how we got from that first Victor to the one that shows up later in Crown of Slaves. And so that's what that story is designed to show. But the way it's done is Victor is never the viewpoint character. The viewpoint character is another man who's looking at him and watching him and can't stand him because, he just considers the guy, a rabid fanatic, which is where the title comes from. And he behaves that way. I mean, it's the way it's depicted. It's you don't know what he's thinking, or all you do is see how he's behaving from the viewpoint of somebody else, and all the way through until almost the very end of the story, he's this very harsh, cold-blooded, sometimes very brutal man, and but then it gets revealed at the end of the story that he's actually the hero of it. It's just an interesting challenge for a writer to do that.
How did you plot this out, Eric? Did you go into this writing? Did you pants it, as they say, or this is so complex a story of what Victor's actually up to here that it seems like it has to be something you might PowerPoint or something like that?
Well, I almost always plot out something, not necessarily a short story, but if it's anything that's novella length or novel length, I'm going to plot it out ahead of time. I learned that years and years ago it's actually one of the things I learned from David Drake. I used to, when I first started writing, I didn't plot. I just started writing. And then early on, after I published a couple of novels, I was chatting with David on the phone, and I said to him, I don't remember what the context was, but I said to him that I wrote character-driven stories. And David started laughing, and I said, what's so funny? He said, Eric, all new writers say they write character-driven stories. So did I. He said, then I noticed I had a whole bunch of unfinished manuscripts. He said, how many unfinished novel manuscripts do you have on your hard drive? And I sort of hemmed and hawed and said, about a half a dozen. He said, yeah. He said, then I learned to plot, and now I don't have any unfinished manuscripts. So I started, I don't like to do it, but I forced myself to learn to start plotting and to plot ahead of time. And what I found is it does two things. One, it improves the story. Secondly, it saves me time in the long run because I'll have to spend a few days plotting a story out ahead of time. And I come up with pretty detailed plots. But then once I start writing, it makes the writing a lot smoother, easier, and quicker. So it's been quite a while since I wrote Fanatic, and I don't even know if I have the plot still around. I probably do. But I know I had to think it out ahead of time because it's not so much that the plot is all that complex, but the presentation of it is, in the sense that you've got to have all this stuff. It has to be shown from the viewpoint of someone other than the person who's really at the center of the story.
That's true, but at the same time, Eric, the viewpoint character also has a secret that he manages to keep until the very end.
Yeah, that's true.
As well.
He does. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It's just really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and he's a very attractive character in his own right, and then he reappears in the series in one of the later novels David and I did together, Cauldron of Ghosts. And, no, actually, I think he appeared in Torch of Freedom, too. I tend to forget.
Yeah. That's Yuri. I can't think of his last name.
Yeah, Yuri Rademacher, yeah. Yeah, he's a kind of basically nice guy who just sort of, kind of by accident, wound up being, part of the ruthless secret police, which he doesn't particularly like. And well, anyway, yeah, so this is all seen from his point of view, and he does not like, the character Richard Shaw, because the guy just seems to him like a fanatic, which, as it turns out...
Can you tell us a little of the setup of the story? We're at this place called the Marines or something like that.
Which one are you talking about, Fanatic?
Yes.
Okay, what happens there is it takes place, this is not going to mean a lot to people who aren't sort of familiar with David Weber's Honor Harrington series, which is a very complex, sprawling series in its own right. I mean, he's got, 20 novels, something written in that series. And I came in sort of midway, so I had to fit these stories into an already existing complex framework. But this story happens just before the final coup d'etat, where where the sort of ruthless dictatorship is overthrown. And the hero of
the People's Republic of Haven.
Yeah, right. And the central character, Victor Kasha, is actually part of the revolutionary movement, but nobody realizes that where he's coming, because he is himself a member in good standing of the secret police, and he arrives in this rather isolated star system because his predecessor was murdered, and he's initially sent out there to find out what happened. And then what happens is he basically takes control of the system, and does it under the guise that he's trying to ferret out who the murderers were, and because he suspects treason. What he's actually doing is something quite different, but it's not clear to the people who are watching him. He's just scaring them. But he does things kind of oddly. The way the story works is just, I did a good job with it, if I say so myself, is that Victor is presented, he is such a intimidating character, and you have to portray that in the actual writing, because you can't do any of it from his viewpoint. It's all got to be people looking at him. And he just intimidates everybody. And if it's written right, and I did, it's not hard for the reader to understand why this guy, even though he's quite young, winds up running this whole star system with an iron hand. And what he's actually doing is laying the groundwork for a revolution, but you don't realize that until the end. And the guy who's watching him is actually sympathetic, would have been sympathetic to what he's doing if he understood that's what he was doing. It's a tricky story. I enjoyed writing it a lot, and I think it's a very good story.
It has a nice romance as well.
Yeah, it does, between Yuri and Sharon Justice, who's another secret policeman that he's got across. Yeah, it does. And then that's continued later in a couple of novels David and I wrote later. There are very few stories of mine that don't have a romance in them, especially longer stories. Short story might not. But there tends to be a lot of romance in anything. All right, 1632 has 4 romances in it. I just enjoy writing them, and it's kind of ironic because the stereotype is that women write romance, men don't. But with several of my female collaborators, they wanted me to do it, and because they didn't really want to write the romance. So I did that when the book I did with Marilyn Kazmata and one books I did with Kathy Wentworth. They both said, "You write the romance part. I don't want to do it. I want to write the action part."
Let's talk about another one of the longer pieces that you have, Operation Zalba. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, the X is G. It's Xibalba. It's a Mayan name. That story is that was written for the Poul Anderson commemorative volume, and what Gardner wanted people to do was pick whichever one of Poul Anderson's various universes that he created and write a story in it. So, as a kind of homage to his legacy. And I chose to write mine in the universe that he created in his novel called Operation Chaos, which is a fantasy novel I've read years. I read it when I was a youngster, and I always liked it a lot. So he wrote 2 stories in it. He wrote 2 novels, Operation Chaos, the first one, then he did a sequel called Operation Luna. And my story is set in the same framework, although I don't use his character. I just felt that would be difficult. So I created a set of characters of my own. And basically it's just an adventure story that's in the same setting. And it's kind of, I tried to make it a fairly lighthearted story because those novels by Poul Anderson, well, they're certainly not comedies, but there's a certain kind of light flavor to them. Nothing really... some of the novels he wrote had some grim stuff happening. That doesn't happen in Operation Chaos. It's a more mystery kind of story. And so I tried to have that same feel come into Operation Xibalba. And that story is set in a Mayan mythological framework, which I use that partly because for various reasons, I studied a fair amount of that. And secondly, it's really grisly as all hell. So, you can use it. I know this sounds a little weird, but you can use that really grisly stuff to tell a story that's kind of not a comedy, but it's pretty lighthearted just because it tends to get so over the top. And the Xibalba in the title is a reference to the Lords of Xibalba, which were 12 gods the Mayans had who were really, and they weren't their only gods. These are the 12 sort of really nasty gods. And they are the villains of the piece. Anyway, that's the
Bain put out that book, by the way. It's called Multiverse.
Yeah. It was originally, I don't know which publisher originally did it, but then, Bain picked it up and did I know Bain did the Manspark, and I think we reissued...
we did a trade.
too, yeah. Oh,
yes,
was it a trade? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a nice anthology.
Yeah.
I say so myself.
Yeah. What else? Also in here, some collaborations with Dave Freer and some others as well. What is? Are you ever going to revisit that Rats and Bats universe? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Just remind people that it exists because it's some cool stuff.
Yeah, it's. I wrote that was the first I've written. Boy, Dave Freer and I have now collaborated on. I think it's 10 novels. Sometimes just he and I, and sometimes the two of us with Mercedes Lackey. Rats, Bats, and Bats was the very first book we did together. And it's the basic idea for it came from a short story I wrote, which I'm trying to remember if it's included in this volume. Hold on, let me look at the table of contents. I know I included it. I can't remember if it's this one or the first anthology. Just give me a second. Yeah, it's in this volume, Worlds 2. It's called The Soldier's Complaint. And it's very short. It's only 1,500 words. And I wrote it just kind of on a whim a long time ago. And then when David and I started talking about doing a novel together, which was actually Jim Bain's suggestion. He said, because David and I met each other on Bain's bar. We met virtually because he lived in South Africa. So it wasn't for several years that I actually met him in person when he and his wife, Barb, came to the United States for the WorldCon in 2000. It was held up in Chicago, which is where I live. And so Jim suggested that we do a novel together. So Dave and I started talking, and I said, I've got this short story. I never got it published. I've always liked the basic idea. So I sent it to him, and he liked the basic idea too. So we used that to develop that whole setting. It's basically it's a story told in time of war and between humans in a colony planet and these sort of ferocious insect-like aliens. Although it then turns out by the end of the story that the aliens who are actually behind all this and the real enemy are the ones that humans think are their friends at the beginning. And it just tells a story of this one draftee, he's a grunt, and the gimmick, because it's more fully developed than that. But the premise is that this colony, it's a colony. It's not that heavily populated. They wind up genetically engineering, well, they call them rats. They're not actually rats. They're actually mostly developed from insectivore stock. But they look like rats, and people call them rats, and they kind of have a ratty temperament. And bats are also developed, and they become soldiers. So you've got these humans mixed in with rats and bats who are also soldiers fighting off these aliens. And the rats have one temperament, which is they don't take anything too seriously, and they're very, very pragmatic about everything, and whereas the bats tend to be idealists, and it's hard to describe. You have to read the stories, but I think David and I did a good job of mixing in these three species and their very different temperaments and stuff. And there is a romance at the center of the story between the grunt and they wind up rescuing the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the colony who's suffered brain damage, but she's got the same. These rats and bats are kind of cyborgs because part of the reason they're intelligent is because they have computer chips on them. And it was a lot of fun to write. And we did a sequel called The Rats, the Bats, and the Ugly. And then we wrote a prequel, which is actually a novella. And actually, the three stories make a complete whole. It's a trilogy. It starts with Genie Out of the Vat. Rats, Bats, and Bats is actually a second story in it, and the third and final story is Rats, Bats, and the Ugly. And one of the central story arcs, believe it or not, is a romance between a man and a rat. And if you're wondering how we pull that off, well, you have to read the book. That sort of starts the first story and ends the last story. Anyway, we did later because I raised it with Dave because by then I was editing Jim Bain's Universe magazine, and I suggested to Dave we write a story together, go back to the Rats, Bats, and Bats. So we wrote one called Crawl Space, which takes place about 100 years after the events that take place in the original trilogy. As to whether we'll ever return to it, probably not. It's, the problem is it's fun to work in, but I've got so much on my plate already, and so does he, that I just don't know that we're going to ever go back to that.
Yeah. Well, Crawl Space is in the collection. Let's find out what Eric is working on right now.
Right now, I am working on my next solo mainline novel in the 1632 series, which the 1632 series is a huge, sprawling series that now has, I think, we're up to 21 novels and 12 anthologies, plus a magazine that's been running for going on 12 years. But there are some novels, I call them the mainline, because they're sort of the spinal cord of the whole system. And those are I either write them alone or a couple of them I wrote with David Weber. And the last one, which was the sixth novel in the mainline, was Ottoman Onslaught that came out in the beginning of last year. And this one, which is called 1637, A Polish Maelstrom, is the direct sequel to that. And it's scheduled for publication. Bain's already got it slotted for publication in April. So I've got to get it finished.
Yes.
And it's going quite well. It's going quite well. And
Very cool.
But that's what I'm working on right now. There are other things that I can't write around the clock. So there are other things, especially because I do so much collaborative writing. I'm also doing other things at the same time. Reichspor, with whom I've collaborated on 5 novels so far, he just sent me a couple of days ago the first draft of the third and final novel we're doing in the Castaway series. And that trilogy was a follow-on to a trilogy we initially did, which we call the Boundary Trilogy. The 3 novels in that were Boundary, Threshold, and Portal. So I've been reading through that, and I'm taking notes and doing some line editing while I go. And depending on what I think when I get done, I may do some more writing on that. I don't know. Reich's gotten to be such a good writer in his own that I tend, nowadays, I feel kind of embarrassed because the first novel we did together, I did a lot of work on it, but with each succeeding novel, he does more and more, which is just an increase in his skills. So that came in. I'm also doing a project with Kevin Eikenberry. It's not exactly a collaboration. He's already written a novel called The Crossing, which is set in my C.D. Shards framework. It's not a 1632 novel. It's more like Time Spike, where another C.D. Shard produces a different time travel event. He's already written the novel, and it's finished, and I gave him a fair amount of help on it, but I didn't do enough to put my name on it. And what I'm doing instead is I'm writing a novella. I'm going to write a novella which connects to his story, and we'll publish the two together in a volume. So that I've got sitting here that I've been working on. And Walter Hunt and I are doing a novel called The Sundering, which is part of the series that we created with Kevin Anderson and some other people. The first novel in that series just came out a couple of months ago. It was written by Kevin Anderson and Sarah Hoyt, called Uncharted. Came out in May, and it's set in a kind of cross between alternate history and fantasy, which is set in colonial America. And Walter Hunt and I are doing the second novel in that. We're close to having it finished. I just wrote my bunch of chapters for that I sent Walter before I started working on the novel I'm working on now, and then he's working on his. He'll kick it back to me. There's a couple of chapters I still have to write, and then we'll have that wrapped up. And I think that's it at the moment. Chuck Gannon is going to be starting on the first draft very soon of the next collaboration he and I will do in the 1632 series, which is called 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line. And that's a direct sequel to the novel he and I did a few years back called 1636, Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. But I haven't talked to Chuck a few weeks. He's close to starting it or has started. I'm not sure which. He's got other projects of his own going, of course. And I'm probably missing something, but that's what I can think of. The thing I'm mostly bearing down on myself is the novel I'm writing, obviously. I mean, that's what I get up in the morning and work on all day. In fact, I broke off to do this talk. And I will be going back to it as soon as we hang up.
And the other thing about Worlds 2 that I do want to mention is that there's some really early Flint stories in here that I don't know if anybody's ever seen anywhere else before.
No,
and they are sort of allegorical even. They're kind of like almost limb-like from like the Siberiad in the way. Then you take on, you do some or maybe like the joking in Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. You take on fundamentalism in these stories.
Well, yeah, it's not so much fundamentalism. It's because that term can mean different things. It's literalism. There are some preachers, especially ones who collect a lot of money on TV, who claim that they are interpreting the Bible literally, that word for word. And if you do that, what usually would happen is one of them would piss me off, because of some ridiculous or usually nasty thing they'd say. And just because I was irritated, I wrote these before I was trying to become a writer. I mean, I wrote those way earlier in my life. And so I would just sit down and write one of these stories. There are 3 of them that are in this anthology. The only one I ever tried to get published was The Truth About the Götterdämmerung, which I sent in many years ago. 25 years ago now, I guess. I sent it into a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And I got a very, very nice, rather long handwritten rejection letter from Kristen Catherine Rush, who's since become a friend of mine. I didn't know her at the time. And she rejected the story, but she said she really enjoyed it personally, but she said she didn't think it was suitable for the magazine. And I couldn't argue with her because I didn't think it was suitable either. I just sent it in because what the hell, why not? It's hard to describe those stories. I mean, those stories I really kind of wrote for myself, and I hope other people enjoy them. They're all comics. They're not meant to be, they're comedies. They're not serious stories. And I enjoyed writing them. I hope people enjoy reading them.
And you can only find them in Worlds 2. So
you can only find them there. They don't exist anywhere else, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay.
I'd like to remind anyone who's listening that Worlds 2 is going to be out on the Baen website and in booksellers everywhere. So please make sure to pick up a copy because it's really well written and the stories are really good.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
Both of them had magic in their blood. Curious, the black shape slowly lifted itself from the floor and slid forward into the light. The demon flowed so smoothly that its movements were like pouring oil. It had to twist its wide shoulders to fit through the door. The soft wood crumbled to bits as the demon's razor hide rubbed against it. Once on the platform, the demon no longer had to slouch. It rose to its full height, towering over Ashok. The young Nayak at the jungle's edge hadn't been exaggerating its size at all. Sighting a demon on dry land at all was a rare experience. Most men would go their entire lives without seeing one. Ashok had seen 4, and this was the biggest by far. Demons came in many shapes and sizes, and it was whispered that truly vast beings had been seen amid the waves. But the ones he'd fought had been shaped like men. Mostly, though each of them had been distorted in a different way. This one was too tall, its limbs too long, its fingers longer still, and each ended in a black point. There were 3 fingers, splayed wide, with a translucent webbing between them. Its legs were too short, too squat. Its head was a lump, nearly featureless except for a horizontal line that divided the lump in half. The oceans belong to demons. Land belongs to man. So says the law. Ashok slowly lifted his arm, revealing his black steel blade. The line across its otherwise blank face split open, revealing teeth, black and shiny and sharp as the rest of its body. It let out a hiss of air that sounded surprisingly dry and raspy. That was the first sound he had ever heard a demon make. It must have recognized the sword that had been dispatching its kind since the age of kings. The penalty for trespass for either side is death. Now they understood each other. The demon bolted. Ashok went after it. Demons were faster than men, but a protector was no longer just a man. He caught it before it could get around the side of the castless barracks and struck. Nothing in the world was sharper than an ancestor blade, and it cut smoothly through the demon's back. Their blood was thin and milky, and it shot out as if it were kept under a great deal of pressure. That wound was deep enough to fell any normal being, but it only stung the demon. It spun, swinging at him, but Ashok dodged aside as its claws obliterated the barracks wall. Moving as fast as lightning, the demon lashed out over and over again. Ashok moved back, placing his body to avoid the blows, and turning aside the rest with his sword. The demon's claws and bones were grown from a material harder than steel, nearly as hard as the ancient sword, and glowing sparks rose whenever they met. Ashok was not concerned for his sword. The chips were from the demon's bones, because nothing could harm this sword except dishonor. He had fought and defeated 3 demons, but combined, the many bearers of Angruvedal had killed nearly 100. And though their memories were not perfectly clear, their instincts remained, and they belonged to him now. The demon's erratic movements were expected, almost predictable. Ashok dodged a mighty blow and ran the edge of his sword up the demon's arm in response. White blood hit him in the face. Demons didn't have veins and arteries like a man. Instead, the interior of their limbs was a solid slab of dense meat, white as snow, all of it soaked in their thin blood. But like a man, let the blood out and they began to weaken. The protector attacked, lunging forward to drive several inches of black steel between its flexible ribs. Their vitals were hard to reach, and even when pierced, they didn't die quickly. The creature flowed back, out of reach of the sword. If demons felt pain, they never showed it. They were like protectors that way. It leapt to the side, crashing through a railing to fall to the next level. He thought about letting it go. No one really knew how demons' bodies worked, so maybe he'd wounded it enough that it would slink off and die. But the law was clear. The penalty was death, so he had to be certain. If the demon couldn't dive directly into the depths, it would head for the surf. Where the 2 worlds met was no man's land, but in anything not shallow enough for a man to see his feet, evil lurked. And then Ashok would be the trespasser. He had to catch it before then.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com, to Ali Heilman, and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz.
And a bottle of Elven Joy Juice, a pinch of fairy dust, snuff, and loads of thanks and praise for Eric Flint, author of Worlds 2.
Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.